or the back and would like to come to the center to make a cozier atmosphere, then please do. Now, I read Timothy's book, The File, really by chance almost, when it very first came out. I had no particular knowledge of the subject, but I remember being very hooked on the notion of somebody who has been spied upon, then when there's a political change in a country, going back to look not only at the records of what was said or written or recorded about him, but also to try to actually examine the nature of that process, what it does to a society, what it does to the individuals who are spied upon, the individuals who spy, and those who are simply caught up in the process of the time. And I'll maybe come on to this a little more later, but I mean, I personally have some knowledge of this, because when I was very young, I think when I was 18, I traveled in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and more specifically in Poland, in the days when the Berlin Wall was still very much up. In Poland at that time, in early 1985, there was an element of revolt. So I went, for example, to the church where Father Popiełuszko had been the priest. He was a priest and campaigner who was killed. And I can remember, in a way that is almost impossible to think of today, the way that you were constantly aware that you were perhaps being monitored. In other words, you were in the kind of society where you never really knew whether the conversation you were having with a person was contingent or not. You always had the uncertainty that maybe they had an ulterior motive for what they were asking you, or what they were asking you about a third party, or sometimes what they were asking you to do, or the places that they were asking you to go. And I think that's the context of Timothy's book. Now, he has a slightly unusual position. He's a sort of cross between a public figure and public intellectual and historian, starting out as a journalist and also an academic. And I have to say, I rather admire that overlap. It's quite a difficult thing to pull off during the course of a career, managing to cover so many different areas and different bases. And I know there are some academic purists who don't really approve of all that, but I have to say, as a writer, I admire it hugely, and I think that is the way that ideally any writer should be. Any writer should be engaged in that kind of way. And just before I ask him to read a little bit from the start of the book, why don't you just tell us about the celebrated occasion when you were summoned by Margaret Thatcher in the days when she was Prime Minister? And I think essentially what she was trying to discover from you and other experts on Eastern Europe was, should East and West Germany reunite? I mean, you could argue that it was a theoretical question, because obviously they were going to or not on their own impetus. But in other words, if it were to happen, would that be a good thing? And I think that your reaction was instinctively, yes, it absolutely is. Whereas Mrs. Thatcher, perhaps because of her personal history or experience, was rather fearful of the idea of a united Germany. So if you sort of cast your mind back I think it's perhaps not quite as sort of theoretically momentous as if India and Pakistan were to reunite, but it's not that far off, given how settled the borders of the period before 1990 in Europe appeared to be. So please.
Well, wow, what a slightly surreal note on which to begin here in Jaipur on a sunny Monday afternoon. By the way, when you said that I spent my life between academia and journalism, I was reminded of the wonderful remark of Conor Cruise O'Brien, who did something very similar. And he said, yes, I have one foot in each grave. At least I think he said this, because finally, having quoted this about 100 times, I thought I'd better check my quotations. So I wrote to Conor Cruise O'Brien and said, did he actually say it? But unfortunately, he died before he could answer me, so he had
you better not write to anybody else you're quoting today.
Exactly. So anyway, but anyway, it is like having one foot in each grave. So maybe I can use the Thatcher story to come round to the book. This was March 1990. The Berlin Wall had come down in November 1989. Germany was clearly heading towards reunification, and Margaret Thatcher didn't like it, and she wanted to stop it. And so some of her civil servants called a seminar at Chequers, the country house, a seminar of historians of Germany, people like Hugh Trevor Roper, Fritz Stern, to tell her what Germany would be like, and whether indeed the blonde beast was about to be unleashed upon the continent. And it was a weird event, because there we were sitting around the table, and we could see outside this figure practicing his golf, which was, of course, Dennis Thatcher. And we spent about 8 hours telling her, very, very calmly, that actually this was the most fantastic success for democracy, for the West, for freedom, and if anyone had dreamed of this after the Second World War, no one could have believed their luck. And at the end of these 8 hours, Margaret Thatcher sat up like a schoolgirl at the table, very primly, and she said, "All right, I've got the message. I'll be very nice to the Germans." I'm not sure whether she was, but still, that was the end of that. In this same period, the Germans were getting on very sensibly with ignoring Margaret Thatcher and uniting. And one of the things that the East Germans in particular insisted on was that the files of the East German secret police, the Stasi, which was one of the most feared and probably one of the most effective secret polices in Eastern Europe, if not in modern history, should be opened up in a quite systematic and actually unprecedented way. And since I'd lived behind the Iron Curtain in East Berlin for several years, working on a book about East Germany, I thought there might be a file on me. And so they created, this being Germany, they did it really thoroughly, a Ministry of the Files with more than 3,000 employees, more than 100 kilometers of files, all very carefully. And before you got to see your file, an official had read the whole file, and if there was some personal details of an innocent third party, they took a photocopy of that page, blacked out the personal details, and inserted the photocopy so you couldn't see the original. And so here I go into the Ministry of the Files, and if I may, Patrick, I'll just read just a couple of pages to give you the beginning of the book. So this is me going into the Ministry of the Files. "Guten Tag," says bustling Frau Schulz. "You have a very interesting file." And there it is, a buff-colored binder, some 2 inches thick, rubber-stamped on the front cover, OPK Akta MFS XV 2889/81. Underneath is written in a neat clerical hand, "Romeo." "Romeo?" "Yes, that was your code name," says Frau Schulz, and giggles. I have my own version of why I was called Romeo. There's the official version, and then there's the unofficial version. I sit down at a small plastic wood table in Frau Schulz's cramped room in the Federal Authority for the Records of the State Security Service of the former German Democratic Republic, the Ministry of the Files. As I open the binder, I find myself thinking of an odd moment in my East German life. One night in 1980, when I was living as a student in East Berlin, I came back with a girlfriend to my room in a crumbling Wilhelmine tenement house in the borough of Prenzlauer Berg. This was a room with a view into it. Large French windows gave directly onto a balcony, and were it not for the net curtains, people living across the street could look straight in. As we embraced on the narrow bed, Andrea suddenly pulled away, finished undressing, went over to the window, and threw open the net curtains. She turned on the glaring main light and then came back to me. Had this been, say, Oxford, I might have been a little surprised about the bright light and the open curtains. But this was Berlin, so I thought no more about it. Until, that is, I learned about the file. Then I remembered this moment and started wondering whether Andrea had been working for the Stasi, and whether she'd opened the curtains so we could be photographed from the other side of the street. Perhaps those photographs are lurking in this binder, which Frau Schultz has already inspected. What was it, she said? You have a very interesting file. Hastily turning the pages, I'm relieved to find that there are no such photographs here, and that Andrea, my then girlfriend, does not appear as an informer. But there are other things that touch me. Here, for example, is an observation report describing a visit I apparently paid to East Berlin on the 6th of October 1979 from 16:07 hours to 23:55 hours. The alias given me by the Stasi at this date was, less romantically than Romeo, 246816. 16:07 hours, 246816 was taken up for observation after leaving the Bahnhof Friedrichstraße frontier crossing. The person to be observed went to the newspaper stand in the upper station concourse and bought a Freie Welt, a Neues Deutschland, a Berliner Zeitung. Then the object, that's me, walked questingly around the station. 16:15 hours, in the upper station concourse, 246816, greeted a female person with handshake and kiss on the cheek. This female person received the code name Beret. Beret carried a dark brown shoulder bag. Both left the station and went conversing to the Berlin Ensemble on Brechtpass. 16:25 hours, both entered the restaurant Ganymede Berlin mit am Chefbauern, and so on, and so on. Minute by minute, detailed description of what I was doing every minute of every hour of that day. How many of you remember what you were doing every minute of every hour of a day 30 years ago? And what I realized as I went on reading was that Proust might have had his Madeleine, which he dipped in his tea to bring back childhood memories, but I had something much better. I had a 300-page poison Madeleine with all this extraordinary detail. And what I decided to do, as you described, Patrick, was to investigate the Stasi's investigation of me. And I was going to go back, and I was going to go through every page of the file, which was full of reports by informers who were identified only by pseudonyms, code names, and professional Stasi officers and other such sources. And I was going to track them all down. And by the way, because I was doing it as a scholar, I actually had access not just to my file, but to all their files as well. So I could read all the informers' files and all the secret police officers' files. And in the end, as you know, and this is much of the story of the book, I managed to track down almost every single one of them, almost every one of them who was still alive, with one exception, agreed to talk. And what I do in the book is not just tell my own story of being spied upon, but I try to understand what it is that brings someone to be a secret police informer or a secret police officer, and how this almost perfect Orwellian police state actually comes to function so effectively that it doesn't need a latte, it doesn't need a stick, let alone a gun, because it's got people under control without the need for any violence. And that's the beginning of the book.
So I think when you found Andrea, that she just said she wanted to take a look at your face. So if anybody is with their lover in the next few days and they pull back the curtains, don't think that the IB is trying to take photographs from across the street. They're just trying to get a good look at you. It reminds me, in fact, slightly when you're describing the process of looking for the people, a bit like writing a biography, where you're trying to pin down as many facts as possible by finding the people and getting their recollections of the same event, which invariably are described in a slightly different way. One of the very vivid memories that I have of Warsaw in particular, and in fact of Krakow, in the neighboring country of Poland, was was just the feeling that very often people were suspicious of those close to them. I remember being told, for example, we are almost certain that the driver is reporting, or in one case a sort of household servant is almost certainly reporting. This was in a diplomatic setting. If you want to have a conversation about anything at all difficult, go out into a park and make sure that you're not in a place where a directional microphone can be pointed at you. I mean, obviously the technology was a great deal less sophisticated than it would be now. Can you just describe something of that atmosphere? Because I think that, you know, most of us have really never experienced what it's like to be in a place where you could potentially be spied upon in that way.
So it was my working assumption
that you were being
that
monitored.
I was being spied upon. So in that sense there was no surprise. And, you know, I spent more than 10 years traveling behind the Iron Curtain before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism, and wherever one went, that was the working assumption. And so, and dealing a lot with dissidents, and so you would, of course, take precautions and either write things down, or I remember one wonderful moment in Warsaw, in Poland under martial law, when I went for a walk with a dissident friend in a park, and she had a few messages that she wanted smuggled back to the West for help, which she had written down on in tiny code handwriting on like cigarette paper, like rice paper. And when she'd given me the messages, she just popped it into her mouth and ate it. It's the only time I've actually seen someone literally eat their words. And so it is true that we worked on that assumption, that there was, and of course, when I said the perfect Orwellian state, the perfect totalitarian state, is the one that doesn't need to resort to torture or direct physical violence, that's how it works, because it works by fear, by the assumption that the Stasi is everywhere. What is shocking, nonetheless, is to find, and this happened in one famous case in East Germany, to a active dissident who discovered that her own husband had been informing on her for many years. And they would go for a walk in the park with the kids on Sunday, and on Monday he'd be off telling the story to the secret police officer. And as she said before she divorced him, he was married to his Stasi officer. He wasn't married to me. So what is shocking is to find that people you really trusted were actually informing on you.
Do you think that today the technology of surveillance being so different means that where a state does wish to monitor its citizens, the entire process and therefore the kind of overall psychological aura of the country in question is different?
Well, what I think is this, that the people who know more about you and me than we ourselves do are no longer probably the security services of our countries. They're called Google and Facebook, because they know a hell of a lot more than you ever remember, because they have the whole of your search history for the last 5 years and everything you posted on Facebook and all your connections, and they use all that information, in theory, anonymized. I stress, in theory, anonymized. By the way, it's probably a good thing we're not having this conversation in the Google Mughal tent, because that might be considered heresy.
That's true. Definitely the microphones would be cut off.
Yeah, I'd be cut off at this point,
Google
indeed.
Mughal.
I'd be carried off stage by friendly Google groupies. Now, that in itself, and they use this incredible amount of data, which is beyond the Stasi general's wettest dream, I have to say, not to oppress you, but to sell you to advertisers, to customized advertiser. In the new book I'm working on, which is on free speech, I look into this quite closely. And what I actually think, Patrick, is that the really dangerous moment is when the quite formidable security service of a state and the Googles and the Facebooks, what someone rather provocatively calls the spying advertising empires, get together, right? And this has actually happened in the United States, of all places, in the context of counterterrorism, where the state authorities can go to Google and Facebook and everybody else and say, give us everything you have on Patrick French, and you can't even tell Patrick French or anybody else that we're doing this. And if you put together what all the private superpowers know about you and what the state knows about you, then you're really in trouble, because they know more about you than you do yourself.
Although, I mean, interesting, I mean, you could say that the reason that Osama bin Laden managed to survive on the run for so long was simply by, not using those forms of technology.
Yeah, and I think he was much on Facebook. That's true.
The only other place where I've been where something similar was happening was Tibet. So I travelled there in 1999 for several months in order to research a book, Tibet. And although the atmosphere of the country is quite different, for example, East Germany or Poland, just because of the nature of the society, you also have, and still have today, that very strong sense of being monitored, in particular by the SSB, the State Security Bureau, but also by lower level organs of the People's Armed Police and other groups. And because I was researching and trying to write a book while traveling as a tourist, I had to be exceptionally careful never to keep any information that people had given me in interviews anywhere near their name. In other words, everything was coded for their protection. And I remember being very shocked several weeks into being in Lhasa to discover that a young girl of about 19 who was a hotel receptionist, who would sort of chat in a bubbly, friendly way every day, was an informant for the SSB. And it turned out that the reason was simply that pressure was put on her father to tell her this is what you must do. Did you find, when you were unraveling the story of what had happened in order to write the file, that in a way every family relationship was undermined or even destroyed by the fact that people had no choice but to be part of that system?
I absolutely and categorically reject the notion that one didn't have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
I think even the prisoner in the Gulag or the Stalag had a choice. Whether you or I personally would have been brave enough to make that choice is a question I've often asked myself, and I ask myself throughout this book.
Yes.
You and I had the huge privilege to be born in a free country, and one of the reasons I was actually able to write this book in this way is that ultimately I wasn't a victim of the secret police, because all that happened to me was they kicked me out and didn't let me back into the country for a few years. So I wasn't a victim, so I could go back without that sense of resentment. But I think you could always, and it is actually documented, that you could resist, you could make the choice. But the other side of that coin is that, I went and talked to all these people who informed on me, and also the Stasi officers, and what you find is human, all too human. It's ordinary people with ordinary motives, just as you find them in our society today. One person did it out of personal ambition, another out of vanity, another for a bit of money. In the most touching, actually heart-rending case, if I could just spend a moment on this case, because it just illustrates the dilemmas people faced. An elderly Jewish communist lady who I hugely admired, very dignified, very noble, She had become a communist as a young Jewish woman in Berlin in the early 1930s, just as Hitler was coming to power. Now just think for a moment what that involved in terms of courage. Married another communist, exiled to the Soviet Union, rounded up in Stalin's purges, husband 10 years in the camps, their kid put in an orphanage, had a terrible time, came back to East Germany nonetheless, still a convinced communist, and then their son grew up, and as so many did, fled as it was still possible to do, to the free West. And then the Berlin Wall went up, and this woman had not seen her son for about 10 years. And then the Stasi came to her, and I'm not going to use her real name because I don't want to, but let's call her Frau Schmidt. And they said, Comrade Schmidt, you're a good comrade. We know you're a good comrade. You're a loyal comrade. We just need a little help from you. Just tell us a little in very general terms about the cultural life of Berlin. What's going on, who's up, who's down, what's going on. And gradually, like a fisherman playing in a fish on a line, you can see in her file, because I read her file, them playing her in and gradually leading her in to give more and more detail. In fact, until she was just a plain common or garden informer, giving little bits of detail to her on me, which may have seemed innocent, except that they put it together with detail from lots of other people.
And of course, once somebody is given a certain amount of information, they are compromised fatally.
They've got them. They're on the hook. And you know what? Then she got out to see her son, who she hadn't seen for 10 years. And I met her when I discovered this story, and she sat opposite me, and she said, listen, what am I to say to you, Tim? Es ist alles nicht so einfach. It's just not so simple. Let me tell you the story. And then she told me this whole story. And within 20 minutes, I was saying to this person who had informed on me, who am I to sit in judgment on you? It's not for me to ask for some sort of apology. It's almost the other way around. She had had such an infinitely tougher, more tragic time. So there are those stories too. And the lesson of that story, of all these stories, is number one, that one of the world's most evil systems can be made to work without your finding a single truly evil person. It's built by 1,000 threads of ordinary, all too human people. And lesson number two, that the judgment always has to be individual, on every individual piece. You can't just dismiss people as a group. You have to see the individual story.
There was a sentence which is running around my mind, which I think Nadezhda Mandelstam wrote, about the idea that a society that is monitored in that way sort of becomes collectively mentally deranged. People become very depressed. They find ways of sort of removing themselves from everyday life. And I have to say that in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, it didn't seem to me to be like that. I noticed, for example, in Poland that people were constantly telling jokes about figures in the Soviet leadership. They were sort of insulting jokes, and people would be careful who they told them to, but that was what was underlying it. Whereas in Tibet, that was not the case. People were much more nervous what they said. And also in Tibet, what had happened was that the history that had created that situation, if you like, the political history of the previous 30 years, had simply been eradicated. So apart from members of the older generation, there was really no way of knowing what had happened. There was no free access to information. So what I'm asking really is, do you think the society that you're describing there is something that is very specific to how East Germany worked, which was essentially to do with how, you know, German history had gone for, let's say, the previous half century or century? Or do you think it's simply some larger effect on a society?
Was it the bloody Prussians, once again, as it
exactly.
were?
Can we take it back to the Franco-Prussian War?
You know what? A lot of other East Europeans like to say so until they opened their own files and discovered that their own secret police were doing much of the same stuff. what I mean, I think that, I mean, first of all, there were lots of very good jokes. That's absolutely true. But jokes are a safety valve. They're a substitute for fighting the system, rather than actually. When people really started fighting the system, the joke quotient went down quite a lot, actually. There were a lot of jokes about the stupidity of the police. For example, why do our police always walk in threes? One who can read, one who can write, and one to watch over those two intellectuals. That was the one there.
And then there was one of why does the Soviet Union not invade Canada? Because it would have nowhere to import wheat from.
Yes, that's very good. Or what is a string quartet answer an East German symphony orchestra after a visit to the West, and so on.
That's a good one.
We could carry on along that line. But I think I wouldn't go too heavy on the specifically German thing, except in one respect, that Germany is a country of historical scholarship and record keeping, and Germany is the unique case of a country which had two totalitarian dictatorships within a single lifetime. And having tried to brush it under the carpet for some time after 1945, in the 1950s in West Germany, came German unification. They said, now this time we're going to get it absolutely right. We're going to be the absolute models of how you deal with a difficult past. And you know what? They were. No one has ever done it better. And they devoted this amazing effort. So that, for example, my file, before I got to read it, this nice Frau Schultz had gone through the whole file, renumbered every page. So it had been numbered by some East German clerk, and then renumbered by her, carefully read, blacked out, etc., etc. 100 kilometers of files treated in the same way, opened up very rapidly. What was the result? The result was that the term Stasi completely took off. And because it's a kind of half rhyme with another word a few of you may have heard of, namely Nazi, or as Churchill used to say, Nazi, Nazi and Stasi, it became a synonym for the kind of totalitarian secret police. And what's so fascinating is, actually, the KGB was much worse. And it may turn out that the Chinese security service in many ways were much worse, certainly much more brutal. But the one that has taken on as a metaphor, and I like to think that in a very, very small way, one might even have contributed a little to that, but what contributed even more was a film some of you may have seen called The Lives of Others, which had a huge impact because it took the methods of Hollywood to tell the Stasi story. We poor writers of non-fiction have to stick to the facts, whereas he can take off with it. But anyway, what's happened is that the word Stasi has become the worldwide synonym for a certain kind of totalitarian secret police terror. And in Britain, I don't know if this is the case, maybe it's not the case in the Indian press, but in Britain now, if anyone wants to denounce some nasty government measure, or even an oppressive school teacher, you say, this is becoming a Stasi state.
Right. So I think, I remember when I read through the files of Indian political intelligence, which was an offshoot of the British Security Service, which monitored Indian revolutionaries, to some extent in India, but mainly Indian revolutionaries traveling around the world, particularly to places like Ireland, Germany, Italy, France, during the sort of period of roughly 1905 to 1947, it became clear there that many leading figures in the freedom movement who had their own files, which I've looked through, people like Jyoti Basu, he actually had 4 files, he was doing so many revolutionary things, and even, of course, continued to do them in West Bengal up until the 1990s, as the state busily revolted against itself, but that's another matter. But someone like Krishna Menon, for example, it was very clear that a lot of these people were being monitored and reported on and documented by people in their own offices. But because those papers were not released until about 50 years too late, they didn't have the opportunity to go after those people. When the Stasi files were opened and people realized that somebody who they trusted, who was close to them at work or at home, behaved in that way, did they turn on them in a vicious way? Did they want revenge? What did they do?
Of course you can't generalize. Of course there were the strong confrontations, but the overwhelming majority of cases, to the extent that one can generalize, certainly from my experience and that of my East German friends, were in the end cathartic. And actually, what was amazing to me, you might think as soon as I rung up someone who informed on me, they'd immediately say, alarm bells would ring, and I'm awfully sorry, I'm just off to Timbuktu tomorrow for the next 3 years. Not a bit of it. They were keen to talk, and they were keen to talk because they wanted to explain why they had done it. And as I said to you, when you listen to the whole story 9 times out of 10, you could understand, and if not forgiveness or reconciliation, there was some sort of understanding. So I have a very strong conviction that it is a good thing for a country emerging from a dictatorship to face up soon and squarely and openly to a difficult past. But then it has to be across the board, because one of the bad things that happened in this case was that all the files, East German files on the East Germans were opened up, but not the files on the Westerners who've been working with the Stasi for various reasons. And so that was a bit where it looked as if it was only just the East Germans. If I may, just on the British files, because like you, I then had the thought, well, hang on a tick, we have a security service too, and there's MI5 and MI6. And so I wandered along to MI5 through a very kind introduction from somebody one or two of you may have heard of called John Le Carre, who happens to be a mate of mine, and with a very nice door opener to MI5, and they very graciously, the head of MI5, agreed to receive me and talk about the noble work they were doing to protect us against all these nasty people who were trying to undermine British democracy. And I sort of edged the conversation around, and finally I said, and by the way, do you have a file on me? And he said, yes, as a matter of fact, we do. He said, but it's a friendly file. And so I said, okay, all right. He said, I said, could I see it? Actually, I've seen my East German one. And he said, no. And I said, if you don't mind my asking, why not? It's the property of the Crown. Only in Britain, ladies and gentlemen, could you get such a ridiculous, fatuous answer, what passes as an explanation as, it's the property of the Crown. And I did then press him a little bit further, because even he felt as if this was a little bit pathetic, I think, actually. Honestly, it's the property of the Crown. And then it was more or less, well, you see, old boy, we do like, because we might have wanted to be in touch with you at some point, and it would have been awfully embarrassing if we didn't remember exactly who you were. So it was a sort of politeness, to keep a file on you. But nonetheless, I think for us, too, it's actually very, very important that after a period of time, in our imperial history for sure, but also in our own domestic history, we should open our own files and see what our guys are up to too.
Well, in fact, by chance, I have recently looked at some of the Colonial Office files. In other words, all British former colonies, except India, which was dealt with in its own government department, because India pre-1947 was not classified technically or legally as a colony, but as an empire, the Indian Empire. Strange that it may seem. And they are really quite astonishing, some of the files on Caribbean countries, on places like Aden or Malaya, Ghana. It is extraordinary the level of attention and detail that was given to monitoring the people who then became the first ministers or prime ministers of those countries. So I guess that the British were doing it efficiently, but they were generally more hesitant to release what they were doing. Although interestingly, in India itself, I don't think the monitoring, even during the sort of radical phase of the nationalist movement ever appears to have been quite as detailed as it was in some other countries. Shall we open questions up to the floor? Do you want to say anything? Yeah, okay. So please do. There are several people here on the right-hand side.
Hello, and thank you very much. I had a question about what do you think, how much time does it take when you see the falling of a major establishment like the Stasi for the actual dynamics in a society to change when the files aren't opened? Because I've just started doing a little bit of work in Burma, and there, of course, you've had Dorsu make this famous declaration, you know, freedom from fear. And a lot of things are changing very quickly. And I was just wondering, you know, how do you think society, you know, it's very interesting to see how people's tonalities are still careful, but they're starting to slowly open up. If you could talk a little bit about that.
I mean, that's a great question. I'm actually going to Burma next week, and we'll be meeting with Dorsu and talking about transitions to democracy. The last time I was there was 12 years ago, when I had the absolutely unforgettable experience of speaking at the NLD headquarters with Dorsu interpreting my talk on transitions from democracy to dictatorship, which was quite a privilege. I think interpreting in more than a linguistic sense, for sure. It was an absolutely electrifying moment. And one of the questions they kept asking was, well, what are we going to do about these guys? What are we going to do about the military? What are we going to do about the police? What are we going to do about the torturers? And the truth is, if you're going to do it non-violently, in a peaceful, negotiated revolution, Gandhi style, Aung San Suu Kyi style, and she's very insistent it should be peaceful, velvet revolution, then the price of velvet is that in some sense most of the bad guys get away with murder, right? They're not actually going to be locked up, let alone hung from lamppost. And what's even more, as Sue put it to me herself, they're going to keep some of their ill-gotten gains. That was her own phrase, because one of the ways a transition like that works is that there's a way out for them. Okay, they give up, you know, military and political power, but they keep their economic power. Okay, so what then happens is people say, hey, we're supposed to have had a revolution. We're supposed to be free. But there are these horrible people, these ex-KGB guys, these ex-military, and they're living in vast mansions up the hill, and I'm still in a hovel down here struggling. And they get very angry. And they say, where was the revolution? Where was the sense of catharsis? And this is where it becomes so important to open the archives and to have your Truth Commission, as they did in South Africa. So you have this great symbolic moment, right, when you face up to the difficult past in a very public way, and you say, we faced up to it. We know the bad stuff that was done. We know who did it. We may not have justice in the sense of criminal justice, but at least we have truth. And so one of the things I'm going to be saying just next week in Burma is, please guys, if you're going to do your Velvet Revolution, also try to open those archives and have the Truth Commission.
Although you have to watch out with being interpreted. Jamil Ahmad, the author of The Wandering Falcon, who was here until a day or two ago and who worked on the Pakistan-Afghan frontier for many years as an officer, said that when you're being interpreted, when you're dealing with the tribes, then you have a risk that that person might have their own motivation and alter your words to produce a particular effect. And he was complaining about the fact that the Americans in particular had this problem of not knowing the relevant languages. And famously, of course, at the time of 9/11, the FBI and CIA between them only had one Pashto speaker. I guess they've got quite a lot more now.
Well, I have to say, I wouldn't worry about in the case of Aung San Suu Kyi.
No,
she'd only improve on what I said.
Okay.
I just had a question. Are modern-day intelligence services engaging in the same sorts of activities as the Stasi in the UK, in America and Australia? And as citizens of those countries, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
And I mean, I won't ask about India because that would be rude. I'm a visitor. But if I can ask about the UK, America and Australia.
Well, I wouldn't worry about being rude.
We have freedom of speech on this stage.
But you simply wouldn't get an answer from me because I wouldn't know the answer. I'd love to hear the answer from somebody who does. But in brief, I think the answer is this. As I was saying in the conversation with Patrick, the technology at their disposal makes the Stasi look like the Flintstones. It looks like something from the Stone Age. So that, and particularly when, and this is I know in the US and to some extent in the UK, possibly in Australia too, when you take incredibly broadly drawn counter-terrorism legislation, and I have to say I believe there is some comparable legislation in this country, for the state, which is actually not the most modern, to go to the Googles and Facebooks and Twitters and all the rest of the mobile phone companies and say, guys, give us everything you've got, and put all that together, and then they take it to a company in Silicon Valley, which I've actually met, and say, now you guys, maybe probably some Indian IT guys in Silicon Valley, if you don't mind my saying so, and they put it all together, and what you get is this unbelievably detailed account, not only of your past life, but also they know what you're going to do tomorrow before you do yourself. So then the question becomes, okay, they know far more than the Stasi does. What are they going to do with it? And that should be the big difference. That if we really do live in a free country with the rule of law, in a democracy, then they can't just use that stuff to go and blackmail and torture and oppress and so on, okay? Now, I'd love to say to you, I have complete confidence that's the case. In all cases, our guys never do it. What I would say is, so long as we have a free press and an independent judiciary, they may, some of the people may get away with it some of the time, but they won't get away with it all of the time. And sooner or later, it will come out.
I mean, but it may be just worth saying that in the case of the UK, for example, that when we've had things like the 7/7 bombings, that there clearly is some need for monitoring citizens inside Britain and what they're doing. And the British intelligence services are now, or have been set up or re-set up by statute, so they are governed by law in a way that they certainly weren't.
I beg to differ. I mean, obviously, men who mock at uniforms that guard them while they sleep and all of that. I mean, obviously, it is true that there's a danger of militant Islamist radicalization in Britain and other West European countries, and you have to watch out for the terrorists and so on. And therefore, in that sense, you need all kinds of informers and so on. But I'm afraid I absolutely do not think that the structure of supervision of the intelligence services is adequate. It's some loyal old politician who's in the pocket of the security service, or some retired old
Do you think that was true of Lord Carlisle, who had quite a good reputation for independence?
Up to a point, Lord Copper. Up to a point, Lord Copper. I really think that just for the reason that we've been talking about, because the potential power is so enormous that one actually needs a much stronger structure of supervision.
Okay, let's take some more questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Oh, hi. I was.
Sorry, you first with the microphone.
You seem to have thought a lot about what all of these questions mean in today's day and age, and you've already spoken, I think, almost directly to the WikiLeaks case as well. I wanted to ask you if you have an opinion on how it's changed kind of the locus of choices that each one of us faces. Are we all online almost by default informers on all of our friends?
Not to mention on yourself, above all, because the person you're most informing on, when you go on Facebook and Twitter and other social media, and with your Google searches, which, I mean, I wouldn't personally necessarily want the record of my Google searches over the last 2 weeks to be shown on screen. Would you? Because in a way it's a kind of intimate autobiography. We are giving these countries an extraordinarily intimate record of our lives. And you have to understand that this is the only way these private superpowers, these giants, make their money. It's customized advertising. If it weren't for customized advertising, Facebook's public offer would have done even worse than it did, and Google wouldn't be the giant that it is. So I think we should be extremely careful about what we put up online, and bear in mind that once it's up there forevermore. And internet time is simultaneous time, and what happened 12 years ago is still happening today. So in that sense, I think we have to we have to have a much stronger consciousness of the kind of transparent globe in which we're operating.
Okay, so there's another question here from the lady on the right.
Just in response to that, on the other hand, we just can't live in constant anxiety. You have to.
Right.
You have to. Well, I just wanted to make a comment apropos the comment about technology, which indeed is true and well taken. That I, soon after the Julia Childs film came out, and she says, Meryl Streep says, oh, yes, of course we did, and she's talking about having reported on her friends when she was in China. And we had an American friend visiting, and he immediately justified what Julia Childs had did, and I realized from the way in which he did it that for all those years that he had been visiting us, and we had been introducing him to our circles of friends and so on and so forth, he was also gathering information. He was just gathering meaningless information which perhaps had absolutely no purpose, but it was just to create sort of texture.
Can I just ask you, where was this happening?
In India, here
Uh-huh.
yes. And he'd been visiting us, and he still continues to be a friend.
He was reporting back to where? I'm sorry.
I'm not quite sure. He wouldn't say, but there was some that his purpose to India was often just information gathering in addition to the other things he was doing.
But sorry, if you don't mind saying, from which country was he?
Oh, from the United States.
Oh.
Sorry. Yes.
From the United States.
That's
Indeed.
right. Sorry.
Indeed. Well, I
It
think
perhaps worth just saying, Timothy, that there are several quite prominent past generation politicians who have been outed in the Indian press as being CIA informants, including one former prime minister. But the supposition is that that was actually a false report, because it seems highly unlikely that he was indeed doing that job.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, a couple of things to be said there. Firstly, even if a close friend of mine was informing on me to the good Lord or Buddha or whoever you'd like to believe in, if I didn't know about it, I'd feel some personal sense of betrayal, right? So that's true. Nonetheless, in the moral judgment on it, you do have to make a distinction. And I'm sorry, but informing to the United States, however critically you look at it, ain't the same as informing to Stalin's Soviet Union or Mao's China. So there's a moral judgment to be made there, and I think that's important to say. That's not to say the end justifies the means, but the end certainly qualifies the means. To your very first just passing comment, one of my conclusions from this book is this. To have a file like that, to be confronted with your own younger self through the critical, hostile eyes of the Stasi, is an extraordinarily interesting but also testing experience.
Did you come out well or badly?
Oh, far be it from me to say.
I think you came out pretty well.
I mean, not without certainly some mild embarrassment, as one might find when you actually see. You see, one of the things you find about this is that we all have a permanent novel in our head which we call my life. And this novel is constantly being rewritten. As we grow older, we retell and tell again the story of my life. And the episodes of our youth are adjusted to fit our own personal story. And if you could actually be transported back to how you really were in 1988 or 1993 or 1972, it's a pretty disconcerting experience. But it's also a kind of moral mirror, because it shows up all your own hypocrisies and your little double standards and your little lies and your pretensions and so on. And my very personal conclusion was perhaps one should try to live as if the Stasi was watching you all the time. And if you could live as if the Stasi was watching you all the time, and at the end of your life not be ashamed of what was in that Stasi file, by God, you'd have lived quite well.
And you made a point when you thought you were being monitored on the telephone of insulting your own journalism, which was being written under a pseudonym in order to disguise your real identity. There's a questioner here on the left-hand side.
Since my friend Melissa won't ask the question, I'm asking a question on our behalf. The modern day Stasi is basically Google Alerts. And I'm surprised that we seem to see the file and monitoring as prerogative of totalitarian states, when Hoover was doing more or less the same thing 30 or 40 years much before the Berlin Wall came up, or rather around the same time, and perfected the art of keeping files on almost a lot of important people in the United States, including the president, and probably was the start of keeping files in modern open societies.
So who was keeping files?
Hoover.
Oh, Hoover.
Yeah, so I think from a totalitarian aspect, we keep saying Russia, East Germany, Iraq, Burma, but actually it all started back in predominantly democratic open societies, which perfected the art of keeping tabs on fellow human beings.
Okay, do you want to address that?
Well,
question?
hang on a tick. I mean, I think you could go back to Xerxes and, the ancient world to find secret polices. I mean, I think there have been secret polices as long as, in fact, for sure there have been, as long as there have been empires and dictators. But I would say again, I mean, I'd be the last person to want to defend the FBI of J. Edgar Hoover or the McCarthy era. But nonetheless, I think one does have to make moral distinctions according to the political system that apparatus is serving.
Shall we take one quick final question before we close? Yes, at the back. Thank you.
Hi. In the extract that you read, you said that when you first sat down, it suddenly occurred to you that maybe your ex-girlfriend had written something about you. And I just wondered how much you thought about these things beforehand, and if it was an easy decision to go to your files, or if you were slightly scared to find out who had said what, and if you think that is a barrier to a lot of other people going to their file.
You know, that's a very good question, because I'm a writer. I couldn't resist the temptation. It's obvious, you know. You just have to do it. But I do have quite a few friends across Eastern Europe, in fact across the post-communist world, who say, I just don't want to know. I just do not want to know. I just don't want to have that experience of being disappointed in close friends and having to confront them and so on. But the one thing I'm sure of is that people should have the right to know, should have the choice to know if they want to. And then, you know, if they make the free choice not to look in those files, well, so be it. That's up to them. As I said before, I would have to say, on the whole, I think when people have gone through it, even if they found out that close friends informed on them, they found it a cathartic experience, and quite often they've remained friends afterwards. And by the way, when I told this old girlfriend of mine, Andrea, about it, when I tracked her down, she absolutely killed herself laughing. She just thought it was so ridiculously funny that I could have this suspicion. So, but I was lucky. As I say, there was someone whose husband spied on her.
Well, remember to live your lives as if the Stasi are watching you. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Timothy Garton.